Good morning to you all on this fifth Sunday of Lent. As you probably know, at present we're not able to hold any church services within the church, and therefore I'm trying to find ways of doing church, especially our main Sunday service at 10:30. I'm going to start relatively simply and just concentrate on the readings this Sunday, which I think are particularly apt at this time. They include Ezekiel 37, 1-14, Psalm 130, Romans 8, 6-11, and our Gospel reading is John 11, 1-14. And I'm going to this morning concentrate on the Ezekiel passage and our Gospel reading on the raising of Lazarus. To help us in this, there are some pictures and verses from the text which will be on the screen. Please forgive me if this is a bit rough around the edges, but I have to do the sermon or homily in one take, so there probably will be a few pauses and ers and ums, but hey-ho, let's give it a go. In today's Old Testament reading, God says, "I will open your graves and bring you up out of them." And I want us to hold that verse at the forefront of our minds as we look at these two readings. Because in the Gospel reading, the grave of Lazarus is opened and he is led out. Our two stories about being brought out of death into new life, and this seems particularly relevant to what feels like a watershed moment in our history. BC and AC, as someone has coined it, before COVID-19 and after COVID-19, where things may never be the same again, and that certain things might end and it might be the beginning of new things. And when Ezekiel is shown the valley of dry bones, it's a metaphor for the death of Israel, the great nation that God raised up to be a blessing for all the world. And all that is left is now a handful of exiles in Babylon. Never in the history of mankind had or has a nation been so defeated and so scattered. Ezekiel knew that, the Babylonians knew that, everybody knew that. Similarly, Lazarus, like Israel, was dead, really dead, and had been for 3 days. All that was left was corruption, stench, and decay behind that gravestone. So Ezekiel looked over the mass graveyard of the valley of dry bones. And Jesus looked at the stone in front of the cave where his friend's body lay. They looked at death squarely in the eyes and saw the reality, the sheer enormity and power of death. Ezekiel was struck mute, and Jesus was deeply shaken and troubled. He wept. Neither Ezekiel or Jesus glossed over the horror and heartbreak of death. The grief, the real life-shattering, gut-tearing grief that hurts so terribly, and what Jesus felt is very real. And the tears of Jesus sanctify every tear, and his deeply troubled spirit make holy our own grief, pain and fear in the face of death and our own present situation. When Ezekiel looked at those dry bones and when Jesus stood at Lazarus' tomb, they didn't see resurrection, death naturally blossoming into new life. Now Ezekiel and Jesus saw that death is real and it hurts and it destroys. Yet they saw something more. They had a hope and a trust that God was bigger than what was happening before their eyes, that the Spirit of God would open up the graves and life would come again. And they responded by speaking out in hope and trust. If Ezekiel had kept his mouth shut, those bones would have stayed dry. And if Jesus had not called out, Lazarus would have stayed in the tomb. And at the same time, in both stories, there is no promise that everything will go back to how things were. Lazarus doesn't become a famous celebrity. In fact, Lazarus's life gets messier and more complicated after the miracle. Similarly, Israel never again becomes the power it used to be or wanted to be. The dry bones formed into something very different, something less powerful and less successful, but truer to its mission than Israel had wanted, hoped and prayed for. The promise of new life is not always a promise that we want or are in control of, but it is new life nevertheless, and it is new life that at a soul level goes deeper than before. In our present pandemic, the spectre of death surrounds us, but there are other deaths, smaller deaths, yet deeply significant, happening all the time. Endings and losses. Some temporary, but some permanent, that we are all experiencing. As a community, we have experienced the loss of a beloved member of our community, Mary Inman, not from COVID-19, I might add, but a death we as a community must face. She was one of the most positive and life-giving people I have ever met, and she will always hold a special place in my heart, as in my first few weeks here at St.Columba, when I went to visit her, and for the first time ever in my ministry, and the last I might add, she offered me a sherry around 11 o'clock in the morning. I thought I was onto a real winner, coming to Crosspool. However, probably for the best, both for me and the community, it's never been a pattern that's been repeated. But there's also been the loss of church as we know it, the loss of physically coming to church, of shaking a hand or hugging another, singing with each other, taking the bread and wine. And I know profoundly that I miss these things, and I miss seeing many of you. But church, and to a large extent life as we know it, has died at the present time, and we need to really see how we can bring life to it again. Our two Bible stories are, of course, a foretaste of the death and resurrection of Jesus, which is not just a one-off miracle that proves that Jesus is God, but I think a blueprint for our lives, not just our lives, but all creation. Just look at the spring flowers bursting from the darkness of the earth after the death of winter. We will suffer many deaths and losses, many graves to be opened, but the Bible suggests that life can always potentially come from them. As it says, "O my people, I am going to open your grave and bring you up out of them." This is the hope that we hold on to, that God will open the grave, and this may be hard, as like Jesus we may be faced with the stench and decay of what is behind the stone. But again, our hope and trust is that we will be brought out by God both individually, like Lazarus, and collectively, like Israel. Maybe not in the way we expect or desire. As Richard Rohr says, God's primary job description is to redeem, to bring life out of death, to bring good out of evil, to redeem and heal the broken and painful. And whatever deaths are before us, we have a choice to despair and do nothing, or to trust and act, to give up or to go on, to abandon hope or to let go in faith and carry on. And that choice can be terribly hard. And more than at any other time, the reality of death in whatever form is a call to trust that the dry bones can live once more, and that out of death and decay life can come, that the grave is opened and we will be led out. And our faith says, Jesus is the Lord of the living and the dead. His voice carries through the walls of the grave, and his word is the strongest word and last word. That's the good news. The purposes of God and the love of God cannot be stopped. not even by the worst happenings in the world. Amen, and may the peace of God go with you. Please look after yourself and stay well. Lots of love from me. Goodbye.